Hi everyone. This is the last recorded lecture for the week 3 content. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the portions of chapter 2 in the book that we didn't get to in Monday's lecture. I'm not going to use slides, and I'm actually going to make this relatively short. So uh, as you know, chapter 2 goes through kind of history up to the present on the way in which engineers and engineer training has connected to sustainable development. And on Monday, we talked about the way that is historically rooted in colonialism, the development of empires, and then that we didn't talk about this. There's a somewhat similar thread that you can trace the post World War II era, where there was a lot of effort dedicated to essentially trying to restore areas that had been seen a lot of war damage during World War II, and also to try to kind of counter the potential influences coming from the Soviet Union and a sense of a kind of democracy promoting in contrast to or in opposition to a spread of communism that was much on people's minds after World War II. So, and then we did talk a bit, I think, about how events that were signals of technological accomplishment, big symbols like Sputnik, the way in which those caused reactions within the US education system, and actually a kind of hand wringing and angst that perhaps the US was falling behind on technological innovation, and the way that fed into education and attempt to make education, engineering education, more scientific, more technical, um, to try to uh, compete better in the global innovation stage. The Apollo moon landing was basically viewed as an example of success on that front. Um, so, so that brings us up to the portion I wanted to talk about in this lecture. And so I want to kind of pick and choose a few topics. So one of those is the issue, this phrase, the lost decade, that's associated with the 1980s and the Reagan presidency in the United States. And one of the things that points out is what significant effect U.S. policy can have on international efforts. And so if the U.S. leadership chooses not to invest in international development, then that has a major effect on what takes place, and a major effect on various activities. And so that lost decade phrase is intended to capture a time period politically and socially where the the market, the economic forces, and a lot of faith was put in the market to be an arbiter of what would succeed and fail, and what was good and not good. And that's this part of this neoliberal concept that was asked about on Monday. So the 1980s, a real change in the way that at least U.S. policy approached the meeting of needs and the investment in social programs. moving them from government into the private sector. In curriculum, there was another kind of phase of concern about economic competitiveness that in this era and shortly after was rather than being centered around increasing the science and math content of curriculum, was actually in some sense focused on really on the creative side. So an interest in figuring out where and how design education fits in to engineering education, and looking to design creativity as a key skill for maintaining a healthy innovation ecosystem, and remaining competitive. And I think it's interesting to ask yourself, within the Georgia Tech curriculum and within threads, where does design show up? And I think it's um, if anywhere, and I think it is present to some extent in the people thread. But largely speaking, we don't have much in the way of design courses that are targeted towards computing undergraduate majors, and that show up in the curriculum. There is, things like Create X, which structure a separate opportunity to be involved in creativity, are I think the place within Georgia Tech where we're seeing the most investment in um, some forms of design thinking, but we don't see that across the board in the CS undergraduate program. Okay, two more topics. In the current, the sort of last section of the chapter, there's the discussion of the sort of rise of consciousness amongst especially student organizations, to think about how technology can be brought to bear in addressing pressing problems. And this is the sort of uh, uh, engineering to help phrase that's attached to these. Engineers Without Borders being probably the most dominant example of a broad-based student organization. But even when we look at Georgia Tech, and some of you may be involved in some of these, there are at least three organizations that are oriented towards using the skills of Georgia Tech students in various settings. And here I'm thinking of Epic Intentions, um, CS Plus Social Good, and Bits of Good. So these are all student organizations. I'm actually advisor to all of them, that are trying to marshal student capabilities and interests, and connect them to um, opportunities. And humanitarian engineering is a term used for essentially the kind of thinking of a discipline of engineering that is quite focused on humanitarian problems. Student organizations have challenges in any context. Challenges with leadership continuity, with time. Students are busy. With partnership management, given the transient nature of the student experience, and so those organizations um, really should be quite thoughtful about the commitments that they take on and the way that they execute those commitments, um, both because they have challenges as student organizations, but also in the bigger picture, to be thoughtful about whether help is really the right way to approach a relationship with a community. And that also brings up the complex questions of, what constitutes progress, and who decides what would be better for a community and what counts as development, meaning progression, positive progression. So those are complex issues, and there are a number of ethical uh, facets to those questions, and they will come up as we go through the rest of the class. I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that is to comment a bit on terminology. So um, uh, when we have these conversations about communities and about other communities, we frequently want to um, have a categorical word to describe the other that we are referring to as being a potential place for um, community development work to happen. And there are some phrases that have been used over time. Some of them are more in favor than others. So I just want to alert you to some of these phrases. So um, developed world, developing world, that's one characterization. First world, third world, another frequently used phrase. More considered more acceptable, I think these days, is to talk about the global north and the global south. So that doesn't contain a value judgment in the way that first world, third world does, or developed, developing does. Instead, it's a geography. You can have actually, but it actually means more than uh, whether you happen to be north of the equator or south of the equator. It is used, global north, global south, to refer to a kind of division in resource availability and uh, uh, poverty measures, things like that. Rich, poor would be a very blunt, economic-based way of distinguishing um, kind of what all these phrases are attempting to distinguish. So I just want to alert you to those words and phrases. Global North, Global South is the one that I generally try to use if I need that terminology. I think First World, Third World is especially problematic. And so you'll see and hear some of these phrases as we go throughout the class. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 2. And as you know, in your assignment, you're going to think about what an additional last section of this chapter might look like. Really considering what has changed in terms of trends and trends in education or in worldwide concern, governance, etc., that might change the way computer scientists and engineers relate to the world in their work. So I look forward to reading your essays for that assignment due next week on Monday. Thanks.